Hello, everybody. Thanks for joining us for Making the Grade. I'm Michelle Edmonds with Idaho News 6. We are so excited to be with you on this day after the State of the State address. We're going to get to all of those details when it comes to education news, which was the hot topic during the State of the State, without a doubt. Joining me, as he usually does on this lovely Tuesday morning, is Kevin Richert from Idaho Education News. Is it snowing where you are? You might hear pellets against my window while we're talking.
It's gone from snow to rain. So whatever snow we got a couple hours ago has all kind of become a soup. So it's just way out there right now.
Welcome to January. It feels like a January day. If you are joining us for Making the Grade here live on Facebook or on any of our social media platforms, we hope that you'll make your comments, ask questions, give us your take on Governor Brad Little's third State of the State address. Kevin, the biggest takeaway for me, obviously, as we talk about education, is that Governor Brad Little has continued to position himself since he ran for governor and now years later as the education governor. And he is looking at putting some significant money back into education.
Yeah, I think my kind of takeaway in the whole State of the State was that it was a pretty ambitious plan that he laid out and a pretty optimistic message that he was trying to deliver. I kind of posed it as a State of the State where you could tell that an election is coming in the not too distant future. You can tell we're 16 months out from a Republican primary because I felt like the governor was really trying to pivot away from the past year that has been so consumed with the response to coronavirus to start to talk about, well, how do we build the state back up after coronavirus, at a point where maybe the coronavirus outbreak is more in check, when vaccines are more readily available. So he laid out a lot of big initiatives, including, as you mentioned, rebuilding the education budgets.
And to the tune of over $2 billion for K through 12 education. In fact, what caught my eye, and maybe yours as well, is that State Superintendent Sherry Ibarra had proposed an education budget, K through 12 education budget increase of 2.5%. The governor went above and beyond that, and that's not something we typically see.
Yeah, I was kind of struck by that too, that, the governor did come in a little bit higher than Superintendent Ibarra. We have seen that in past years, however. The big thing in this education budget, and I think this is an area where Little and Ibarra are in agreement because this is something Ibarra's been talking about for several years, is to get back to funding the career ladder, to get back to funding teacher pay raises. That's part of Little's budget proposal, as well as Ibarra's budget proposal from back in the fall.
For people who maybe don't quite have a handle on what the career ladder looks like, Kevin, let's skip back a little bit and talk about how there are increments of teacher pay raises, essentially, that are part of this career ladder. And those were put on hold when the pandemic began. So the governor is looking to essentially restart that career ladder, correct?
Right. And I think we have to start with kind of the long political history of the career ladder. This goes back to Butch Otter's time as governor. For several years, the legislature was overwhelmingly supporting the career ladder, putting money into teacher pay. But most of the money went into salaries at the start of the salary schedule for new teachers, for entry-level teachers, for younger teachers. What Governor Little is trying to do, and he's had support in the legislature for this idea in the past, is to build a second layer onto the career ladder, if you will, to build on career ladder one and do something that's more targeted towards veteran teachers who didn't get much of an increase in the first round of pay raises. So you're trying to put money into the salary schedule for the veteran teachers, for those teachers that are leaders in the classroom, that most superintendents will tell you are essential to the school in general. They're the leaders within the school. They're the mentors within the faculty. But those are teachers that Idaho districts are often at risk of losing because they're veteran teachers, they're experienced, they're attractive applicants, and they quite often can make more money going to another state. So what Little's trying to do is to get the legislature back on track to funding the career ladder, to funding teacher pay raises. I believe the line item gets to be about $45 million in this budget request.
As you said, Kevin, the legislature has been supportive of the career ladder. What are the rumblings at the State House this year when it comes to having a surplus in funds? Is this going to be an easy, done, put it in the bank, veteran teachers are going to see additional money coming their way, or is there going to be a fight?
You know, it's really hard to handicap where the fights are going to be, but when you have a $600 million surplus, there are going to be fights. You know, as the governor laid out his agenda for 2021, education was a big piece of it, but so was tax relief, so was transportation funding. And I could envision both of those being real struggles at the legislature, because what Governor Little said, in effect, was that he wants $455 million in tax relief. And there's going to be sentiment for tax relief at the State House. There always is. But the question is, what does that tax relief look like? And Little left that to legislators to figure out. He wants to collaborate with lawmakers on what a tax relief package looks like. And I got to imagine you got a lot of legislators with different ideas about that and with their own ideas about it. And the same thing too, you know, I think the transportation proposal that he has is going to be a big fight, potentially a big fight, because he wants to put some general fund money, more general fund money into transportation. That's something we tended not to do. The state has tended to pay for transportation through gas taxes, through user fees, not through the general fund dollars that go to schools and other state needs. So that could be a battle. So where does the education debate fit into the bigger debates that we'll see this session? I really can't tell you.
Let's hit on a couple of other topics that he addressed specifically in the State of the State and in his budget, because he put quite large line items with early literacy and then advanced opportunities for high school students. That's high school students being able to take more college credits. And of course, that goes back to the go-on rate, which we talked about last week here on Making the Grade, of trying to have more high school students choosing to go on in their education after high school. So $20 million for early literacy, basically a $10 million pot for advanced opportunities. These have been two hot button items for Governor Little, and he's continued to push for them.
Yeah, and these are additional sums of money, Michelle. The $20 million for summer literacy programs is something I know we'll want to take a closer look at. But you know where the governor is on literacy. You know where he is on early reading. This has been one of his top priorities, certainly in education, maybe one of his top priorities, period. So he's looking at the pandemic. He's looking at the achievement gap that has grown during the pandemic as kids are forced to study at home. So he really wants to put the money into this summer reading program so that the achievement gap narrows, so that this doesn't become a lasting issue for kids. The advanced opportunities money, that's $9.7 million of additional money into advanced opportunities. We're already putting $20 million into this program per year. So this is an increase. And it's interesting, you know, it kind of comes at a time when dual credit numbers appear to be decreasing in terms of student participation. Another outgrowth of the pandemic, where high school students maybe are having a more difficult time scheduling college level dual credit classes. So there's been a challenge during the pandemic to get kids to take dual credit, and that's where a lot of the advanced opportunities money goes. So the increase, I'm interested in it. I'm interested in what the governor's vision is for why we're trying to put more money into advanced opportunities right now, and how that would be spent, and where the demand is.
Kevin, as we've talked about on Making the Grade for years, one of the most important reasons why we cover education is because everybody's tax dollars, it is the greatest sum of your tax dollars are going into the topic of education, whether we're talking K through 12 and higher education put together in our own personal tax dollars and what the state spends for each topic when we talk about transportation or education. And that's one of the reasons we're so invested in what the budget looks like for education. Now,
right. And close to half of the budget every year goes into K-12 alone. So we're usually at about 48% of the state budget going into K-12. Then, as you mentioned, we have to factor in higher education, community colleges. You get close to 60% at that point. 60% of the state budget goes into education in some form or another. So think about it when you buy anything at the grocery store, or when you buy anything at at a big box retailer and you pay your 6% sales tax. About 60% of that sales tax is going to find its way into education in one form or another. That's why we pay so much attention to the education budget. That's also why we pay so much attention to tax policy, because that's going to affect what's available for education.
In this 2021 year, though, Kevin, after going through what we did in 2020 in education, don't you think that there's an even greater highlight on schools in general and what is happening with our children in this state when it comes to their education, what's working, what's not working, and could that play a role with legislators?
I think it very well could. I think there's definitely a sentiment at this point with a lot of folks in the State House that if we ever needed more proof of the need for quality teachers, for veteran teachers, for highly skilled teachers, we saw it last year. We've seen it in the past 10 months. So I'm going to be, this has been a popular program for the past several years. The Career Ladder has had bipartisan support at the legislature. The K-12 budgets have sailed through both houses pretty easily. So I don't expect that to change all that much. I'd be surprised if it changed. Let me put it that way.
Let's talk a little bit about the higher education budget, because as you said, K through 12 has literally essentially sailed through the last couple of years as we've been talking about it. The higher education budget does not. So tell me a little bit about what the governor is proposing in his State of the State and budget address, and why there's more of a fight when it comes to higher ed.
Yeah, and I expect that to continue. I think you'll probably have more debate over the higher education budget, however it turns out, as opposed to the K-12 budgets, just based on what we saw last year. Unless we had a real departure, a real change in sentiment, that's what I'd expect to see play out again. I think it really comes down to there's a lot of skepticism within the legislature about higher education, about the direction of higher education. You have a pretty strong cadre of conservatives in the House who are convinced that higher education is getting too much money in the first place, and they're not happy with where the money's going. They feel like too much of the money is going into programs that they consider to be pushing a liberal agenda. So I expect that backlash to continue, and I expect that to continue to play itself out. The governor, probably one of the biggest things he's trying to do with the higher education budget, and what he's trying to do with a lot of the agency budgets, is he's trying to go back in time, and he's putting the money back into the budgets that were cut this year. If you remember way back to July, the governor issued a holdback, 5% of the budgets for all state agencies taken right off at the top, right at the beginning of the spending year. Now, he backfilled K-12 already. He used federal stimulus money to do that. But most other agencies were still living under that 5% cut. They are living under this 5% cut right now. But what he's done in the 2022 budget, which would go into effect this summer, is he's putting that money back into the base. So higher ed, corrections, health and welfare, every state agency starts at kind of where they were at the beginning of the budget year before that 5% cut went into effect. So that was a big development for higher education, and really for most state agencies.
So he's calling for 2.6% for colleges and universities, 5.4% increase for community colleges too. A lot of money going into community colleges. What will we expect to see, Kevin, because the conditions are so different at the State House this year because of COVID-19? Are we going to see the presidents of the universities and the community college presidents making presentations, talking to JFAC, things that we typically see in a year, or do you even know?
They're still going to talk to JFAC. Obviously, they're going to make their presentations. But I was watching JFAC this morning remotely, which is how we're going to cover most legislative committee hearings this year. And it's a very different looking room in order to establish social distancing between the 20 members of the committee, the 20 lawmakers on the committee. You've got lawmakers sitting out in the area that's usually set aside for the public to attend. I think there's maybe like one seat dedicated for the media, for instance, and we usually had a couple of seats. So it's not just us. For the general public, I think it's going to be more difficult to attend these hearings in person. And I think when it gets time for the colleges and universities to make their budget presentations, which comes in 2 weeks, when it comes time for Sherry Ibarra to make her budget presentation in 2 weeks, traditionally, the state superintendent or the college and university presidents would come with kind of a whole team of administrators, a whole team of senior staff to support the budget request, to assist with the budget presentation, to answer some questions if legislators had specific detailed questions about the budget. I don't know how you're getting all these people in the room, because there's very little space for most anybody else. That's just how the legislature is gonna work this year. It's a very different atmosphere, and it was a very different atmosphere yesterday with the governor doing a State of the State address in a remote committee room by himself, not in front of a room full of legislators, a room full of state officials. A very different atmosphere. It already feels different.
I was going to say the fact that there were no pauses or applause. It was one of those moments when you think, this really has changed how we do business.
It's tougher to get a read. It's tougher to get an immediate read on how that speech went over with legislators. I mean, we got reaction from Scott Bedke, the House Speaker, did a news conference afterwards. Democratic leaders did a news conference afterwards. So you were able to get their immediate reactions, but you get an in the moment sense of how legislators feel about what they're hearing during that speech. When they applaud or when they don't applaud. When the governor's kind of sitting there hoping to hear a round of applause for a proposal, and there's maybe a smattering of applause or no applause whatsoever. So it was a very different feel, but that's how this session is going to be. And I think from a health standpoint, it's the protocols are going to be entirely different, and that's not even factoring in concerns about what we saw last week on Capitol Hill and what we saw at the State House in August. I think there's a lot of folks who are very concerned about the safety aspect of the legislature. Now, day one was there were no incidents. It was peaceful. It was pretty laid back. I spent a few minutes there on Monday. It looked very calm, very low key. You hope it continues that way. And you hope that the virus doesn't lead to an outbreak at the State House. You just hope at this point. But it's definitely going to be a session where a lot of us are watching it from afar.
And if you'd like to read any of the interviews that were done, idahoednews.org, definitely the place to go. idahonews6.com. All of our web resources for you are out there, because that's where you can see more of the comments from Speaker Bedke or the Democratic response to the State of the State. Kevin, let me get your take on just a couple of, and we can just kind of go through these quickly if you want to. Some of the other hot takes from the education world that we could see in the 2021 legislature. What about enrollment versus attendance funding? And that sounds very boring, but essentially this is the fight over how do we decide how schools get the money that they do, the districts get the money they do, and is it the number of students they have, or is there some other formula? You expect to see this come up again?
It's going to come up, and it's come up in the past few years. I mean, that's been the whole thrust of doing a rewrite of the funding formula, to go to something that's more of enrollment based. It's very complicated, and it sounds like it's semantics, but it really isn't. And with the idea of an enrollment-based funding model is that the money will follow the students more easily and more readily. So yeah, it's going to come up again this session, driven in part by the pandemic, because it's more difficult for schools to count students in a model where students are maybe having to study at home, or maybe they're in a hybrid model where they're spending part of their time in class and part of their time at home.
Where does that lead us when it comes to school closure authority as well, and perhaps the balance of power that the legislators have been speaking about since the special session was called back in August? There's been so much rumbling over who has what authority, whether that's the governor with emergency declarations, what authority health districts have, what authority school boards have. Do you see this being a topic of interest?
Yes, yes. I think that's going to be a hot button issue, because you've got a lot of legislators who are upset in general at feeling like they were kind of cut out of the process of the pandemic response. I think that's going to be a power struggle between the legislature and the governor in the session. But I think it also goes into a lot of policy issues, including school closure. Right now, what's happening is school districts and charter administrators are making that decision at the local level. They're getting advice, they're getting counsel from the health districts, but the health districts are not making the determination about opening and closing schools. So that's really what's happening right now. But I think legislators are concerned that there's a possibility that it's not always going to be that way, that they want to make very clear that health districts have no such authority to open or close schools. So that issue, I'm sure, is going to come up this legislative session. There were lawmakers who wanted to bring it up in August during that special session, but they will bring it up, I'm sure, in the session. And I expect we'll see legislation on that pretty soon.
It's going to be fascinating, Kevin, to look back on this session and kind of give it a once over in March or April when it finishes, and think about the type of legislation that either is talked about, proposed, drafted, actually put into law that would never have happened had we not had a pandemic when it comes to education. How the pandemic has changed education legislation. And there's going to be some, I mean, for good, for bad, for whatever you want to think about, there will be legislation that happens that no one ever dreamed of a year ago.
Exactly. I don't think we were paying this much attention to health districts a year ago, but we've seen them playing such a central role in school closures or school openings, just even than just their advisory role. They've played a very important role in that. They've played a very important role in, look at the debates we've had, in the Treasure Valley and across the state about mask mandates, about business openings, business closures. Health districts have been such a central part of our story this past 10 months.
On that note, let's quickly discuss before I let you go for making the grade, because I know you've got a lot of work to do now that the ledge is in session. Kevin is always so busy during ledge. But Boise schools going to go back to their hybrid model. Of course, many schools went back after the holiday break. It came back into some sort of hybrid model, or went back full time, maybe even just with the younger students in those districts. But Boise, before even the Thanksgiving break happened, had decided to wait until the middle of January before attempting to even bring students back into the classroom. They have decided to push forward and do a hybrid model, going back to a hybrid model starting next week again. And there was also some talk about vaccines and when teachers will get vaccines. That's going to be our next storyline to follow.
There's a lot to follow in the public schools right now. And you mentioned what's happening with Boise next week. After the Martin Luther King Day holiday, Boise schools will return to this hybrid model, which means that students will spend part of their time in face-to-face learning, part of their time learning at home. As viewers know, this has been a debate and this has been a process really since August. Boise trying to find a way to have some sort of a face-to-face component. It's been a couple of months for students outside of the classroom, so that will that'll change starting next week.
What are you hearing, Kevin, that you're excited to follow when it comes to teachers getting vaccines? I know that Governor Little has proposed to do a news conference coming up here in just a couple of hours where he's going to be talking, I don't know specifically about education and vaccines, but being transparent about where the state stands when it comes to giving out the vaccine. What are you excited to follow as a journalist?
I'm going to want to see the timetable and see when teachers start to get vaccinated and how we roll out the other phases of this vaccination, whether we're talking about older Idahoans, when we're talking about critical workers, when we're talking about the general public. Governor Little was very optimistic in his State of the State address. Maybe a little bit aspirational here. I mean, he was talking about, we're heading maybe into the final lap here on the battle with coronavirus. We're starting to see the clouds breaking a little bit. Now, he was also realistic. He said, look, we've got some tough times ahead here. We're not completely out of the woods here. It's likely to get worse before it gets better. But he was talking a lot about life with coronavirus contained, life with widespread vaccine usage. And for the general public, for folks who don't fall into one of these high-risk groups or don't fall into the category of a critical worker, it's probably still going to be May, the governor said maybe June, before the vaccine is available to the general public. So we're still quite a ways out. And with the, and when we're talking about schools and we're talking about school kids, it's still really up in the air when the vaccine is going to be available, when it's going to be approved for children.
Well, and as every parent is wondering, what does next school year look like? But we'll leave that for a different day. Because right now, we have too much on our plate over the next couple of months to follow education legislation as it makes its way through the State House. Kevin, I'm glad to see that you are staying well, my friend, and we appreciate everything that Idaho Ed News is doing to make sure that we can accurately cover education from the State House. So thanks to you and all the staff working at Idaho Education News.
Yeah, we're committed. We're going to cover the legislature as fully as we have in the past. We're just going to cover it in a different way. We're just going to cover it remotely. So if you're watching this and you have topics that you want us to take on, if you have suggestions, if you have questions, reach out to us, because we may not be there face to face. That's a personal health decision. That's a public health decision that we've decided to uphold. We're not going to go there. We'll go there when there is an event that we absolutely have to cover in person, but we're still going to cover this legislature in depth because, as we discussed, there are some big topics on the agenda.
Well, and we appreciate everybody joining us for Making the Grade, and we'll continue to bring you up to date Tuesday mornings right here. Kevin, have a great day. Thanks for your time.
Thank you. Have a good week.